This clause gives them full control, and you won't even see it until it's too late. The maid's voice said in flawless Arabic, cutting clean through the polished silence of the room. The sentence didn't echo. It landed, heavy and precise, like something that had been waiting to be spoken. A dozen executives froze mid-motion, pens hovering above leather-bound folders, fingers suspended over glowing tablets. At the center of the long glass table, Richard Whitmore's hand paused just inches above the contract, his Mont Blanc pen catching the chandelier light in a thin, cold reflection. For a second, no one breathed. The air itself seemed to tighten. Richard slowly lifted his gaze, not toward the legal team, not toward the translator seated along the far wall, but toward the voice, unexpected, out of place. Near the back of the room, beside a service cart lined with unopened bottles of sparkling water, stood a young black woman in a pressed gray uniform. Her name tag read Ava. She hadn't stepped forward. She hadn't raised her voice. But she hadn't looked away either. The room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. A senior partner leaned back, brows pulling together in quiet irritation. Someone near the end of the table let out a short, disbelieving breath. Another whispered, too soft to be a statement but too sharp to be ignored, "Is she staff?" The translator, seated 2 chairs down from Richard, glanced nervously between the contract and the woman, his fingers tightening around his notes. Just moments earlier, Richard had spoken in rapid Arabic, fluid, confident, deliberate, turning the language into a private corridor of power that only he controlled. It had been a performance as much as a negotiation, a way to remind everyone in the room exactly who held the upper hand. No one had challenged it. No one had even tried. Until now. Ava adjusted her grip on the tray, the faint clink of glass against metal the only sound that dared to move. Her posture remained straight, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady. There was no defiance in her expression. No hesitation either. Just clarity. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the kind of movement that only those watching closely would notice. His gaze sharpened, measuring, recalculating. The room waited for him to speak, to dismiss, to restore order. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, his eyes flicked down to the page in front of him, scanning the dense lines of legal text that had moments ago seemed routine, controlled, predictable. Now they felt different. He tapped the paper once with the tip of his pen, a quiet, deliberate sound. Somewhere in the room, a chair creaked. The silence stretched, thin as glass, threatening to crack. Ava didn't move. She simply stood there, the soft hum of the overhead lights catching in the edges of her uniform, her presence no longer invisible, no longer background. And for the first time since the meeting began, Richard Whitmore wasn't the only one in control of what came next. The badge on Ava Johnson's chest was slightly worn at the edges, the black lettering softened from years of use, as if even her name had been quietly fading into the background long before she ever stepped into that room. 12 hours earlier, she had been standing in a service hallway on the 27th floor, the air smelling faintly of citrus cleaner and polished marble, her hands steady as she folded linen napkins into precise triangles. The hotel moved around her like a machine that never noticed its smallest parts. Guests came and went. Executives passed by without eye contact. Shoes clicked sharply against the floor, voices carried with urgency, but never toward her. She had learned early how to exist without interruption, how to listen without being seen. That was where she lived now, in the quiet spaces between conversations. Ava was not supposed to understand the language of billion-dollar deals or international negotiations. Her job was to clear glasses before they emptied, to replace them before anyone noticed they were gone, to move like a shadow along the edges of power. But her mind did not move the same way her body did. Years ago, in a different life that felt both distant and painfully close, she had sat in lecture halls with rows of students, her notebooks filled with careful notes on global finance, trade agreements, and the subtle traps hidden inside contracts written to look harmless. She remembered the weight of textbooks in her backpack, the long nights under fluorescent lights, the quiet pride in understanding systems that most people never even saw. Then life shifted. Her mother's illness came without warning, slow at first, then all at once, pulling Ava out of school and into a reality where survival replaced ambition. Medical bills stacked higher than any tuition. Time disappeared into hospital rooms and second jobs. The degree she once chased turned into something unfinished, something she carried quietly instead of displaying. Now she wore a uniform instead of a blazer, but the knowledge had not left her. It waited. It listened. Back in the present, the boardroom still held its breath, but Ava's thoughts were clear, grounded in the same instinct that had once guided her through case studies and legal frameworks. She had not spoken to impress anyone. She had not spoken to challenge authority. She had spoken because she recognized something familiar hidden inside the words Richard Whitmore had just delivered. A structure. A pattern. A shift in liability that did not belong where it was placed. It had been subtle, almost elegant in its design, the kind of clause meant to pass unnoticed by people who trusted the surface of what they read. But Ava did not trust surfaces. She never had. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, not from fear, but from focus. She could still see the line in her mind, the phrasing, the way one word leaned into another just enough to redirect responsibility without announcing it. It was the kind of detail most people dismissed. The kind that changed everything. Across the room, the executives still watched her as if she had stepped out of place, as if the uniform she wore defined the limits of what she could possibly know. But Ava Johnson had spent years being underestimated, and in that silence, in that space where no one expected anything from her, she had learned to see what others missed. The room had only just begun to realize that. Richard Whitmore did not look at Ava first, not directly, not fully, because men like him had built entire careers on controlling where their attention landed, and what it meant when it did. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath the shift of his weight, his fingers still holding the pen but no longer poised to sign. The movement was subtle, practiced, the kind that suggested patience rather than hesitation. Around him, the room followed his lead. Shoulders squared. Eyes turned. No one spoke, but everyone waited for his reaction, because in this space, his response was the atmosphere. His reputation had been built on precision and dominance, a man who did not just close deals but reshaped the terms until they bent in his favor. He was known for speaking in languages others could not follow, not out of necessity, but as a deliberate choice, a way to isolate, to filter, to remind everyone present that access was a privilege he controlled. Arabic, French, German, it did not matter which one he chose. What mattered was that no one interrupted. No one corrected. Until now. His eyes lowered again to the contract, scanning line by line, slower this time, as if the words had shifted position without asking his permission. The clause Ava had referenced sat buried in the middle of the page, surrounded by clean formatting and confident language, the kind that looked harmless when read quickly but revealed something else when examined with care. His jaw tightened just enough to register. Across from him, one of the senior attorneys adjusted his glasses, leaning forward with a polite but strained smile. "Mr. Whitmore," he began carefully, his tone measured. "Perhaps we should proceed as planned. The terms have already been reviewed extensively." The sentence hung there, an offering of reassurance, but it did not land. Richard did not respond. Not yet. Instead, he tapped the pen once more against the paper, a steady, controlled rhythm that seemed to echo louder than it should have. His gaze shifted, finally, toward Ava. It was not a glance. It was an assessment. Slow. Direct. Calculated. He took in the uniform, the posture, the stillness. A maid. That was the label the room had already assigned her, the boundary they believed defined her. But something in her expression did not match that assumption. There was no apology in her stance. No nervous shifting. Just quiet certainty, the kind that did not ask for permission to exist. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of something unexpected. "You understood what I said," he stated, his voice even, controlled, the Arabic accent still faintly present in his tone. It was not a question. Ava did not rush to answer. She did not step forward. She simply inclined her head once, a small, respectful acknowledgement without submission. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach him without disturbing the silence more than necessary. A faint ripple moved through the room. Someone shifted in their seat. Another executive glanced down at the document again, this time with less confidence than before. Richard's fingers tightened slightly around the pen, then loosened. The balance had shifted, not dramatically, not yet, but enough for him to feel it. Enough for him to know that something in this room was no longer following the script he had written. And for a man like Richard Whitmore, that was the moment everything changed. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured, starting with a low, dismissive chuckle from the far end of the table, the kind that carried just enough volume to invite agreement without demanding it. A man in a tailored navy suit leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, his expression tightening into something between amusement and irritation. "This is not her place," he said quietly, but clearly enough for others to hear, his eyes never leaving Ava. A few heads nodded, subtle, cautious, as if aligning themselves with the safer side of the room. The translator exhaled slowly, relief flickering across his face as if the tension had found a direction to move in. Another executive flipped a page in the contract, more for the sound than the action, a way to reassert normalcy. Ava remained still, her hands steady against the edge of the tray, the cool metal pressing lightly into her fingertips. She did not look at the man who spoke. She did not look at anyone except Richard. The air felt colder now, sharper, as if the room itself was deciding what to do with her presence. Richard's gaze lingered on her for 1 second longer, then shifted away, not in dismissal, but in calculation. He turned the page in front of him, slower than before, his eyes scanning the clause again, this time tracing each word with deliberate care. The rhythm of the room had changed. It was no longer moving forward. It was circling. "You are interrupting a formal negotiation," another voice added, this one firmer, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "If you have something to say, it should go through proper channels." The words were measured, professional, but beneath them sat something else, something unspoken but understood. "Stay in your place." Ava inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, quiet, her shoulders rising just enough to register, and then settling again. When she spoke, she did not raise her voice. She did not rush. She simply answered. "If you sign that document," she said, her tone even, precise, "the liability does not stay where you think it does." A ripple moved across the table again, sharper this time. The man in the navy suit frowned, leaning forward now, his patience thinning. "That is not your concern," he replied, the words clipped, each one placed with intention. "Your concern is to serve, not interpret." The statement landed, heavy, drawing a clear line in the room. Ava did not step back. She did not argue. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor barely audible, and set the tray down on the side table with careful precision. Glass touched wood with a faint, controlled tap. Then she looked back at Richard. "The phrasing in section 14. She continued, still calm, still steady. "Transfers post-agreement risk entirely to your side, even in cases of external breach." The words were not dramatic. They were exact. Technical. Unemotional. And that was what made them land. One of the junior associates blinked, then quickly flipped through his copy of the contract, fingers moving faster now, searching. Another leaned closer, eyes narrowing as he scanned the same section. The confidence in the room began to thin, replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain. Richard's pen stopped tapping. Completely. His hand stilled against the page, the small movement carrying more weight than any raised voice could have. He did not look at the others. He did not acknowledge the comments. He only looked at the clause. And for the first time since the meeting began, the power in the room was no longer unquestioned. It was being examined. The shift in the room did not go unnoticed, and that was exactly what made it dangerous. Confidence, once steady and unquestioned, began to fracture in small, almost invisible ways. A senior partner cleared his throat, louder than necessary, his fingers tapping twice against the table as if to reclaim control of the moment. "We are not here to entertain speculation," he said, his voice tightening, no longer as smooth as before. His eyes moved briefly toward Richard, searching for alignment, for confirmation, for authority to restore order. But Richard did not respond. That silence spread faster than any argument could have. The man in the navy suit leaned forward. Again, this time with less patience and more intent. "Security," he said, turning his head slightly toward the door without fully looking away from Ava. The word was quiet, but it carried weight. It carried dismissal. It carried removal. At the edge of the room, a uniformed guard shifted his stance, one step forward, then another, measured and professional, his presence firm but restrained. The soft sound of his shoes against the carpeted floor felt louder than it should have. Ava heard it. Everyone did. But she did not turn. Her gaze remained fixed on the table, on the document, on the line she knew mattered. Her breathing stayed even, controlled, her posture unchanged. No resistance. No retreat. Just stillness. The guard stopped a few feet behind her, waiting, as if expecting her to step aside on her own, to recognize the boundary without needing to be told again. "You have said enough," the senior partner added, his tone now firm, final, a decision disguised as professionalism. "This is not your responsibility." Ava's fingers curled slightly at her sides, not in tension, but in focus, as if grounding herself in something deeper than the room allowed. She spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "If the agreement fails after signing," she said, each word measured, "every legal and financial consequence transfers to Mr. Whitmore's company. Not theirs." A pause. Short. Heavy. The junior associate who had been scanning the contract suddenly stopped flipping pages. His eyes locked onto a single paragraph, his expression tightening as understanding caught up with him. Another lawyer leaned closer, whispering something under his breath, no longer dismissive, no longer certain. The ripple had turned into something else now. Not noise. Not chaos. Something quieter. Something more serious. Richard's hand moved again, but this time it was not toward the pen. It was toward the edge of the page, his fingers pressing lightly against the paper as if to hold it in place while his eyes read, then reread the same line Ava had pointed to. The room watched him. Not her. Him. Because now the question was no longer whether she should be speaking. The question was whether she was right. The guard behind her hesitated, his movement paused mid-action, waiting for a signal that did not come. The authority in the room had shifted just enough to make certainty impossible. The man in the navy suit opened his mouth to speak again, but stopped, the words catching before they could form. Ava did not move. She did not look around. She simply stood there, steady in the space she was never meant to occupy, as the weight of what she had said began to settle into every corner of the room, pressing down on the polished table, the glowing screens, the confident expressions that no longer looked quite the same. And in that pressure, something else surfaced, something none of them had planned for. Doubt. The room did not erupt, it narrowed, collapsing inward into a silence so complete it felt almost deliberate, as if every person present had stepped back at the same time and left the moment standing alone. The soft hum of the ceiling lights became noticeable, a low, steady vibration that filled the space where voices had just been. No one spoke. Not the senior partner. Not the man in the navy suit. Not even the guard behind Ava, who now stood completely still, his presence fading into the background the same way hers once had. Richard Whitmore remained seated, his eyes fixed on the document, but no longer scanning. He had stopped moving altogether. His hand rested flat against the page, fingers slightly spread, as if holding it steady against something unseen. The pen lay beside it untouched. The authority he carried did not disappear, but it shifted, turning inward, becoming quieter, more precise. Ava did not move either. The weight of the room pressed against her, not as pressure, but as awareness. She could feel every gaze, every question that had not yet been asked, every assumption that had just begun to unravel. And still, she stayed grounded, her posture relaxed, her breathing even, her eyes calm. She had said what needed to be said. Nothing more. Nothing less. Time stretched, not long, but enough to be felt. Enough for thought to replace reaction. Across the table, one of the attorneys slowly removed his glasses, exhaling as he rubbed the bridge of his nose, his earlier certainty now replaced with quiet reconsideration. Another executive leaned back in his chair, arms no longer crossed in confidence, but resting loosely at his sides, his attention fixed entirely on the page in front of Richard. The room was no longer divided between power and position. It was suspended between what had been assumed and what was now being questioned. A faint reflection moved across the glass wall behind Ava, sunlight shifting slightly as clouds passed outside, casting a softer light into the room. It caught the edge of her face, outlining her features in a warm glow that contrasted with the cool tones of the boardroom. She did not notice it. She did not need to. The stillness spoke for her. Richard's thumb moved once, a small motion against the paper, as if marking a place, anchoring a thought. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in focus, as the full weight of the clause settled into understanding. It was no longer abstract. It was real. It was immediate. And it had almost been signed. The realization did not come with a visible reaction. No raised voice. No sudden movement. Just a subtle shift in the set of his jaw, a tightening that spoke louder than anything else could have. The room felt it. Not as noise, but as change. Ava lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in patience, allowing the silence to complete its work. She had stepped into a space she was never meant to occupy, and now that space was reshaping itself around her presence. No one asked her to leave again. No one told her to stop. Because in that quiet, undeniable moment, the truth she carried no longer belonged to her alone. It belonged to the room. And the room was listening. Richard Whitmore lifted the page slightly, just enough for the paper to catch the light differently, as if a change in angle might reveal something he had missed before, something he had almost signed without question. His eyes moved slowly across the clause again, but this time they did not skim. They measured. They traced every word, every comma, every subtle shift in phrasing that had been designed to look harmless. The room watched him read. No one interrupted. No one offered reassurance. Because now they saw it too, not fully at first, but enough to feel the weight of it pressing into the edges of their confidence. One of the junior associates leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to the attorney beside him. "It shifts all downstream liability," he said, the realization forming as he spoke it aloud. The attorney did not respond immediately. He simply stared at the same line, his expression tightening, his earlier composure thinning into something more cautious. Across the table, the man in the navy suit straightened in his chair, the faint smirk he had worn earlier now gone, replaced by a controlled stillness that felt less certain. Richard lowered the page back onto the table, but his hand did not leave it. His fingers pressed lightly against the paper, anchoring it in place as his gaze lifted, not to the others, not to the attorneys who were now quietly recalculating, but back to Ava. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer empty. It was filled with recognition. "Repeat it," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a sharper edge now, not directed at her, but at the truth he needed confirmed. Ava did not hesitate. She did not step forward. She simply spoke, her tone steady, clear, each word placed with precision. "The clause allows them to redirect any post-agreement risk under the definition of compliance adjustment," she said. "That includes legal exposure, financial penalties, and operational failure, all reassigned to your company once the agreement is finalized." The words settled into the room, not as speculation, but as structure, as something that could be tested, verified, proven. One of the senior attorneys reached for his tablet, scrolling quickly now, his finger moving with urgency as he cross-referenced the language. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed again, the confirmation landing in stages. Another voice, quieter, more restrained, followed. It is embedded under subsection C, he said, almost to himself, as if saying it aloud made it more real. The room shifted again, but this time there was no resistance, no dismissal. Only adjustment. Richard's jaw tightened once more, but now it carried something else, not frustration, not anger, but the weight of a decision that had almost been made. He leaned back slowly, his chair moving with a soft, controlled sound, his gaze never leaving Ava. The authority in his posture remained, but it was no longer unchallenged. It had been refined, sharpened by what he now understood. And if I had signed it, he said, his voice lower now, more measured, they would have walked away clean. It was not a question. Ava met his gaze, steady, unflinching. Yes, sir, she replied. No hesitation. No embellishment. Just truth. The room absorbed it. Fully this time. The magnitude of what had almost happened moved through every person present, not loudly, but completely. Deals worth millions, reputations built over decades, all of it resting on a single clause that had nearly gone unnoticed. Richard's eyes shifted briefly back to the document, then returned to Ava, and in that moment, the balance of power did not disappear, but it changed direction. Because now, the one person in the room who had seen the truth first was the one they had almost asked to leave. No one reached for the contract anymore. The urgency that had filled the room minutes earlier had dissolved into something heavier, something slower, like a realization settling into place where certainty used to live. Richard Whitmore remained still, his gaze fixed on Ava, not as an interruption now, but as a reference point, as the one variable in the room that had proven accurate when everything else had not. His fingers lifted slightly from the page, then rested again, as if letting go required more than just movement. Around him, the executives avoided eye contact, their attention shifting to documents, screens, anything that did not require them to acknowledge how close they had come to missing it. The senior partner who had spoken earlier adjusted his tie, a small, controlled motion that did little to mask the tension in his posture. The man in the navy suit leaned back, slower this time, his expression carefully neutral, but no longer confident. The guard behind Ava stepped back half a pace, almost instinctively, as if the boundary he had been prepared to enforce no longer applied. Richard finally broke the silence, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that carried through the entire room. "Cancel the signing," he said. The words were simple, but they landed with finality. No one questioned it. No one argued. The decision moved through the room like a quiet command, understood immediately, accepted without resistance. A few hands reached for phones. A message was typed. A calendar shifted. The deal that had seemed inevitable seconds ago was now paused, suspended in a space that had not existed before Ava spoke. Richard's gaze did not leave her. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone no longer distant, no longer dismissive, but measured, deliberate, as if the answer mattered. Ava did not hesitate. "Ava Johnson," she replied, her voice steady, unchanged, as if nothing about the moment had altered who she was. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, but it carried weight. "You saw something my entire team missed," he said. It was not praise. It was recognition. The distinction mattered. Ava held his gaze for a brief second, then lowered it slightly, not in submission, but in composure, allowing the moment to pass without expanding it. "It was in the wording," she said simply. "It was not hidden. It was just easy to overlook." A faint shift moved across Richard's expression, something quieter than surprise, something closer to respect. He leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to be noticed. "Stay," he said after a brief pause, the word directed at her, but heard by everyone. It was not a request. It was not an order. It was something in between, an invitation shaped by necessity. Ava did not respond immediately. She glanced briefly at the service card beside her, at the glasses she had not yet placed, at the role she had been assigned when she entered the room. Then she looked back at Richard. "I have a shift to finish," she said calmly. The sentence was simple, but it carried its own boundary, its own quiet strength. Richard studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, understanding more than the words themselves. "Then finish it," he said. "But do not leave the building." The room remained silent, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer filled with doubt. It was filled with something else, something quieter, more grounded. Respect, not declared, but undeniable, settling into the space where assumptions had just been undone. The hallway outside the boardroom felt different when Ava stepped out, not because anything had physically changed, but because something inside her had settled into place, quiet and steady, like a breath she had been holding without realizing it. The door closed softly behind her, sealing the voices, the tension, the weight of the moment back inside the glass walls where it belonged. Out here, the air was cooler, the lighting softer, the rhythm of the hotel returning to its usual flow. Carts rolled past. Distant conversations echoed faintly. Shoes moved quickly across polished floors. Life continued unchanged, unaware of what had just been prevented a few feet away. Ava picked up the service tray again, the metal cool beneath her fingers, grounding, familiar. She adjusted the placement of the glasses with the same careful precision she always had, aligning each one so it sat exactly where it should. Nothing about her movements rushed. Nothing about them reflected the shift that had just occurred. She walked down the corridor at an even pace, her shoes making soft, consistent contact with the floor, each step measured, controlled. As she passed the mirrored wall near the elevator bank, her reflection caught her attention for a brief moment. The uniform. The name tag. The same person she had been that morning. And yet something behind her eyes had changed, not in appearance, but in presence. Not louder. Not bigger. Just certain. Inside the boardroom, voices had resumed, quieter now, more deliberate, as teams recalculated, as language was questioned instead of assumed. But Ava did not look back. She did not need to. The impact of what she had said did not require her to witness it. It was already done. She reached the end of the hallway and turned toward the service area, where the scent of fresh linen and cleaning solution filled the air, where no one asked questions about contracts or clauses, where her role remained simple, defined, expected. She placed the tray down on the counter, the soft clink of glass against steel echoing lightly in the empty space. For a moment she rested her hands against the edge of the counter, her fingers relaxing, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the tension fully left her body. Then she reached for a folded cloth and continued her work, wiping the surface in slow, even strokes, the motion steady, almost meditative. Minutes later, footsteps approached from behind, measured, purposeful, but not hurried. Ava did not turn immediately. She finished the motion she was in, folded the cloth once more, then set it aside before facing the direction of the sound. At the end of the hallway, Richard Whitmore stood, no longer framed by glass and authority, but by the quiet neutrality of the service corridor. He did not step closer right away. He simply stood there, his posture composed, his expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, as if the distance between them required a different kind of respect. For a brief moment, either of them spoke. The space between them held something unspoken, something that did not need to be defined. Then Richard gave a small nod, not as a command, not as a gesture of power, but as acknowledgement. Ava returned it, just as simply. No words followed. None were needed. The hallway remained quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the building and the distant movement of a world that had not paused. And in that stillness, without announcement, without recognition from the outside, something had already shifted, something that could not be undone, not by titles, not by assumptions, not by the roles they had walked in with. Ava turned back to her work, the cloth moving across the surface once more, the rhythm unchanged. But the silence around her felt different now. Not empty. Not invisible. Just understood.